Sorry about that. Thank you for waiting. Right. I am going to talk about Earth observation of landscape fires, mostly thermal. And we have some of this is a bit of a focus on fire emissions because we have quite a lot of the work we've been doing is, especially in recent years, quite focused on helping air quality forecasting. But also a lot of the earlier stages, like fire detection, how strong is the fire burning, where is it happening, the latency issue and things like that, they're all applicable to fire management, basically. If you're responsible for keeping track of fires in northern Canada, then satellites can be very useful if you don't want to do it by aircraft, for example. So a lot of those things are relevant to that, and there are certain missions being developed. We heard from Aurora Tech yesterday briefly. There's a mission in Canada called Wildfire Sat that we're involved in that is going to provide observations of fires close to the peak time, late afternoon, all focused on kind of super low latency data for fire management and observations. So fires are all over the planet. This is MODIS burned area product, which is super widely used. And you can see places like Africa burn, huge areas burn every year. The annual area burned is about the size of India if you add it all together. But actually, it's probably much more than that because this is 500-meter data, and there's plenty of small fires that you can't actually see with 500-meter data. So probably the real burned area is maybe even twice that. There were some studies about that recently. In terms of how that data is used, one of the things it's used for is in this type of equation here, which basically tells you, if you want to know, for example, how much, let's say, methane is emitted by fires every year into the atmosphere, what the contribution of that is to the global methane atmospheric increase, multiply this burned area by how much fuel was on the location before it burned, this mystery combustion completeness parameter, which is basically just how much of this fuel load actually went up in smoke, which all this comes from modeling, these two things, and then we multiply by the emission factor. So how much, in this case, methane is emitted per kilogram of fuel burned. So this thing in the red bracket there is total fuel burned, and you just multiply that by the emission factor. And this is like basically the way this system called the Global Fire Emissions Database works. It's very well understood. Burned area is very well measured, and increasingly so as satellites products get better, and the satellites that feed those products also are improving the images and what have you. The fuel load and the combustion completeness are less certain and more model based. And also, this isn't real time, clearly. You have to wait for the fire to happen till you can measure the burned area. So what we do is focus on thermal observations, as with many other people. So this is Earth observation data from MODIS overlaid over a nice global map showing where your fires are. And you basically see that fires are all over the place. And they're recurrent all over the world. Many countries in Asia, for example, they have like 1 or 2 fire seasons every year where farmers are basically burning huge amounts of material that's left over after harvest. And you can see this is a snapshot of an image taken from a chap called David Roy, who's involved in the MODIS fire product, from one of his papers. And you basically see that in the Russian Federation there, you see burned area coloured by day of detection, and you see active fires coloured by day of detection. And you see there's a very good correspondence. Not one-to-one, because sometimes these are snapshot polar orbiting observations from MODIS, so the fires are moving. So here, for example, though that area might have burned, the satellite wasn't overhead when the actual active fire was burning. So if you're on a polar orbiting satellite, you're only seeing a couple of times a day typically, and you might miss when the fire is actually at a particular location, whereas the burned area captures it all. But this is done in real time, and this is done after the fire typically. And then you have over here in Brazil, you've got all these very small fires, and actually in terms of active fire data, if the fire was burning when the satellite came over, it's actually probably better at spotting them than the burned area because they're just so small. These forest clearing patches and stuff, it's quite difficult to detect them. Although in the heat of the day, the cleared patches surrounded by the cooler forest can actually look like a fire, even if they're not on fire. So those are false alarms. So we have basically this the problem of identifying these things from satellite Earth observation is just a problem of minimizing errors of omission and commission. It's quite easy to detect fires from space. They're very hot. If you've got a thermal imaging instrument that has been designed to measure land surface temperature or whatever, then it's typically very sensitive. And I'll show you in a minute. It's very sensitive to very hot things if it has the right wavelengths. And you have to decide essentially in your algorithm how you minimize detecting other things that aren't fires, whilst retaining good sensitivity to small fires. That's basically one of the one of the main trade-offs. So I thought it was quite fun for me just to put this in. We did this in something like 2004, I think, and this is a chap called Gareth Roberts, who's now at Southampton University, but at the time was a postdoc with us in King's. And basically, we built a large tower at Rothamsted that we've now got a lab at, and we burned stuff because the beautiful thermal cameras outside. This is a super old thing called an Agema, which basically I think Agema were bought by Fleur, and they were a Swedish company. We have a really old camera that was used by British Special Forces in Afghanistan that we bought second-hand, and we basically put it on this 12-meter high tower. There's lots of other instruments as well, spectrometers and stuff like that. And we burned different materials and we weighed the amount of stuff that was burned, and we measured the heat output with these thermal imaging cameras. And these are super old, so it's quite funny I dug all these out. But basically, this is the amount of power in megawatts coming out of that fire over time. So you see here is when it's flaming, and then it starts to smolder and cool down. Okay, and this is the rate of fuel consumption measured by, because the whole thing was on scales. And basically, you can measure the whole fuel mass burn just by taking the two different weights at start and end, one from the other. And you can measure the whole amount of radiant energy emitted by the fire by basically the integral under that curve. We did that, and what we found was this nice graph here. I've linked loads of times. Each of these is the fire, these different soils, organic soils and different vegetation types. And we found that basically, the more you burn, the more energy comes out of it. It's actually pretty obvious. If you buy 2 kilograms of wood and you put it on your fire and burn it, you do expect to get twice the amount of heat as if you bought 1 kilogram, right? It's really obvious. But basically, we can measure this from satellite, this rates of energy coming out. And then that means there's a way to estimate this from satellites, which is really cool. So no more of this modeling and other things. We can do it semi-directly. I mean, obviously there's lots of problems, but that was the idea. And now this thing called fire rate and power, one of these essential climate variables, along with LST and 50 or so other ones designated. So space agencies are I'm not sure about the word required, but at least encouraged to consider measuring this as part of the variables that they provide users. And I'll show a couple of new satellites or recent satellites where we and other people have been involved in making sure that the specifications of these satellites that in the past would have been tailored to cloud measurements and sea surface temperature measurements also include capability for fire. And it's really great that that's happened. What is this? Okay, so this you saw yesterday and probably on Monday as well. The Planck function here. Basically, the situation with fires is we have a typically large pixel, basically because, as we've heard about repeat cycles and things like that, it's even more important perhaps fire because obviously it's changing super dynamically. It might be not there 1 minute and it's there another minute, and 2 hours later in a completely different place. 5 times bigger. So you basically need very, very frequent updated information. And the way to get that is to have large swath instruments which have rather coarse pixels. So typically you have fires that are very much smaller than your instantaneous field of view on the ground. And this is hot, and this is normal temperature, ambient temperature. And those two things go into this Planck function, and you basically get the amount of spectral wavelength zone, this is any particular wavelength, which is this graph here. So X is the wavelength, as you've seen before, Y is in logarithmic space, the radiance, and this is the normal Earth, about 300 Kelvin. This is, say, the minimum temperature of the fire, 600 Kelvin, but they're more like up here. And what you see is, like we heard yesterday, basically as heat something up, the amount of energy it's emitting at any particular wavelength goes up, but the peak of it shifts to shorter wavelength. And in the middle infrared, it is very dramatic. Fires emit maybe 10,000 times, 1,000 times, or maybe even something like 10,000 times more radiance per unit area than the ambient background. Whereas in the long wave infrared, where people are measuring land surface things, they only go up by an order of magnitude. So you can see that it's super useful if you put middle infrared wave bands on your instruments for fire. What that translates to is something like this. So this is a rate of transfer model called Mossband. About rate of transfer. This is one of them. Tells you how much radiation goes, to the atmosphere from the surface to the top of the atmosphere. So basically, we were simulating. There's an instrument called SLSCR on sensor 3, which we do the fire product for. So here are all the bands, S1 to S9, and there's two fire channels, F1 and F2. F1 and F7 are in the middle. I'm not going to get into all this. Basically, this is vegetation. Okay, that's the red edge there, where vegetation absorbs visible light and reflects, infrared. Then you go down here into the short infrared and water because then you have the middle infrared and the thermal infrared. So we've made assumptions of what the vegetation looks like and what its temperature is. And then the red line is the same vegetation with 0.5% fire added in this simulation. So you imagine this big pixel here with the red fire covers 0.5%. And what you find is that this middle infrared signal here has gone up by more than an order of magnitude, even though the fire only covers 0.5% of the pixel. And in the long wave infrared, it's gone up, can you see, a very small amount. So basically, if the fire is small compared to the pixel size, you get a big signal change in the middle infrared and a small signal change in the long wave infrared. If the fire covers the whole pixel, then basically you get a similar, wouldn't be similar, but it would be the brightest temperature. When you convert to the brightest temperature, it would be the same. But when you convert these numbers to brightest temperature, they're super different. I'm going to show this data a bit later. But this is something called Metersat third generation flexible combined imager, which is absolutely amazing and has been suffering some technical problems for the last 2 years. But they're about to release the data, and it is really good. So I'll show you in a minute. But basically, this is the brightest temperatures from that geostationary imager over Africa. If anyone recognises Africa, that is Lake Malawi there, so that's about the size of Britain. All these little white dots are fires taken on one slot, and this is just a brightest temperature difference image between the middle infrared and long wave infrared. So if you take those two brightest temperatures one way from the other, you basically depress all the brightest temperature variations that are the same in the two channels, which are due to things like topography and whether it's water or land and all that stuff gets minimized, and you get maximized the brightest temperature differences due to things like this. So that's why all the little white dots stand out. The other good thing about the middle infrared and to some extent the long infrared, fires produce loads of smoke. These are a bunch of fires off California, and we can completely see through the smoke. So you can't see through cloud. If the fire is very strong, you might be able to detect some of it through cloud, but you typically wouldn't really advertise you can see through cloud, but you can see through smoke, clearly. And you can identify all these fires, and you can then essentially estimate the difference between this green line and this red line. Basically, the extra radiance being emitted by the fire in the red line compared to the green line is the extra radiance emitted by that being present in this pixel compared to if it wasn't there. and that is the fire rated power. So basically, we just need to estimate from the data itself this purple additional radiance, basically. And actually, although it's being emitted over all wavelengths there, you can actually use the middle infrared to do that. I won't really go into it, but basically it's very simple to do. And then we can just apply our nice equation that we got. That's the theory anyway. The nice equation that we got from all those experiments all that time ago, we can just basically measure this and estimate that. Yep. And this is what these kind of data look like. This is the middle infrared. This is the long wave infrared. You can't see the fires in the long wave infrared. This is data with large pixel size. So the fires are pretty invisible here. They're showing up pretty well here. You take the brightness and they show up super well. So that's basically it. Super easy. And it's generally done in brightness temperature space. So showing that along the bottom there. So you just take the inverse Planck function to put your radiances, convert it to brightness temperatures, take the difference, the fires stand out like a sore thumb. As I said, there are some other things that look like fires, but aren't, like sun glints, for example. If you have glints off the ocean, off other water bodies, off solar farms, reflective roofs, bits of bare soil surrounded by cooler vegetation, like I was talking about in the tropical forests, all these things can actually, some only by day, can be mistaken for fire. So you have to have a bit more complicated algorithm than just what I was talking about there. So this is the sort of flow diagram of what we've done for geostationary data. And then you have to atmospherically correct the estimate of rated power output, because you want the estimate of what's coming out of the fire, not what's coming at the top of the atmosphere. But none of it is particularly difficult. It's just this idea of trading off errors of omission and commission to some extent. To detect these big wildfires is like very easy. Basically, this is Landsat data. This horrendous campfire in the States. Incredible imagery, but terrible events. These things are more difficult to detect. Crop residue fires, which are the things that basically are causing a lot of the air pollution problem in economically developing countries. Understory fires is another one where basically the fire is hidden under a tree canopy. And peat fires, this is some stuff we did in Indonesia a couple of years ago, where basically the actual soil is burning underground rather than flaming on the top of the surface. The ground does get hot, you can detect them, but it's clearly, they have to be way bigger than a flaming fire. So all those things are quite difficult to detect, but if there's enough of them, you can detect them. So here is a nice MODIS image produced by NASA on this great Earth Observatory website, I think it is. Fantastic website if you want to have a look. Fires in the Punjab some years ago, loads of basically farmers burning all their rice straw at the same time. So all these farms are all burning small areas, but there's enough of this to be detected by MODIS. And you can see it's all funneling this smoke down this intergalactic plane with hundreds of millions of people being exposed to it. And we've been involved in some research. So some research that was done by Leicester, us, and some Indian colleagues. Basically, at the time of year this is going on, 60% of the air pollution in Delhi from particulate matter is being caused by these fires. That's an estimate. And a recent work with some epidemiologists suggested that 1 in 10 children who die under the age of 5 worldwide do so as a result of this. That is pretty shocking. It's about the same as malaria. So that's one of the reasons why we're really focused on air quality now, because actually you can change. We don't burn stubble in the UK anymore, but we used to. So clearly it's a thing. It's a treatable problem. So I thought that's kind of the background, and I thought I'd show you some of the challenges in this stuff. It's not all amazing and easy to do, and there's no more work to be done. One of the challenges is a little bit relating to what we heard in the previous talk about directionality. So we have that issue here as well. Basically, because if you look at MODIS, for example, which is like the workhorse instrument for this for years, and is now kind of on its way out, but it's done a fantastic job. Here, you might know Modis is pixel size, basically. It's a scanning instrument, and at the edge of the swap, the pixels are enormous. At the middle there, 1 kilometre in the thermal, and at the edge, there's something like 10 square kilometres. And they also overlap with one another because the sampling distance is still 1 kilometre. So you get huge numbers of pixels looking at the same spot. And this is basically 1 year of data for Modis, various different fire rating power statistics, maximum, minimum, against scan angle. And what you see is it's not flat, and this is a logarithmic scale. So, for example, the minimum detectable fire is way higher at the edge of the swab than it is in the middle. Basically, because the pixels at the edge of the swab are 10 times bigger. So essentially, this number is about 10 times bigger than that. So the fires have to be 10 times larger if you're seeing at the edge of the swab than the central swab. And Modis has an 8-day repeat cycle. So every 8 days, you sample the same area at different positions in the swab. And you see all these different statistics have basically the same fold shape. Those is that, at least in the afternoon kind of replacement they have this very clever idea where they basically oversample the data. They take 3 pixels measurements in the center of the swab, which are actually about 125 meters wide, and they average them to make this 375 meter pixel. And then towards as you go out from the center of the swab to the edge, they basically average 2, and then right at the edge they average. Well, they don't have it. They just send down the real data. Unfortunately, they don't send down the original data. They only send down this average stuff. But nevertheless, what it means is when you look at the statistics, they're flat because this pixel size problem has mostly gone away. There is another problem in that these 125 meter pixels, the fire might saturate them because now it's quite a big proportion of them. But when you average it with the surrounding pixels, it may not saturate them. And so that now you can become confused as to whether your measurement is a good one or not. But nevertheless, in terms of detection and a lot of the statistics, it's actually done well. On Sentinel-3, the Sentinel SLSTR, so we are involved in the fire project for that. And that has these 2 channels, F1 and F7. This is a normal infrared channel. This is a special one for fire, mainly special because it can measure up to nearly 500 Kelvin. And what we did, if you were at the talk yesterday where I showed the airborne data, we used some of that data to reflect those daily fires to simulate SLSTR observations of fires at different points in the swab. And what we found was basically that if you measure it in the F7 channel, you get this. Essentially, the fire impact you retrieve for that fire increases as you go towards the edge of the swab. But in the F1, it's got this very special and unexpected characteristic that its pixel size stays relatively constant across the swath, and therefore the retrievals of this particular thing also are not really much affected across the swath. So that was an unexpected benefit of this F1 channel design. And now ESA, who producing the product, we've switched to producing it with the F1 data rather than the S7 data because of this. So that was, all these things are tested for a long time, and it's still going on now. This is the SLSTR product for January 2019. This is the Modis product at the same time. And what you see over here is, this is in Brazil. This is one little tiny example. Here's active fire pixel count, and here's total fire and power. And basically, what you see is the orange, which is SLSTR, is always above the blue. So basically, SLSTR is more sensitive at night, to fires than Modis, so it detects more fire pixels. But they're all of low rated power, which means that when you add them into the total amount of rated power detected per day, it generally does measure a little bit more, but not very much, because if you just add more small fires, it doesn't make so much of a difference. So that's basically, this thing will essentially carry on the Modis Terra observation record. So that will go on for about 24 years, and then this thing is going to take over. They don't exactly measure at the same time of day. It's half an hour difference, so that is a slight issue because fires change quite a lot in the morning. So there has to be work done to do that. Here, when you can measure these small fires, you miss with the course resolution data, it does make a difference in certain areas. I showed it to you. For example, this was some work done by Tian Zhang in Things before she went into the commercial world, and she looked at using burrs and compared it to those over China for agricultural burning. Basically, when this is a histogram, but broadly speaking, you couldn't see fires with nodes less than about 8 megawatts. But when we looked at burrs, at the time we were on the first fire products, so we got to make it ourselves. But you could see all these fires, which were very, very numerous, that you basically missed, which is all these Chinese farmers lighting the fields from straw. And when you look at totals over different time periods, you see a very different difference. So the air pollution produced by all this burning is actually way worse than was estimated, because there's huge numbers of fires that are all being mixed. We did this, if you want to go into detail, I refer to that paper, but basically one question is, okay, so if I'm missing lots of fires because of the coarseness of the data, but I need coarse data to some degree because that gives me high repetition rate, how big should I make my pixels if I'm designing some mission? So basically, we went back, NASA did an experiment even before MODIS was launched, called SCAR-B. And we went back and we took that data over Brazil. It was collected with the U2 and MODIS airborne simulator over Brazil. And we basically detected all the fires with it, and then we started degrading the data and redetecting them with this degraded form of data and seeing how many fires we missed at different spatial resolutions. And these are graphs from the paper, but broadly speaking, here are proportions. You detect very few of the fires at 1 kilometre. You detect a much higher proportion of the firing power at 1 kilometre. So this is the ratio basically of the 50-metre original observations to the 1 kilometre observations. So same thing, you basically miss most of the fires, but actually the big ones you do detect are responsible for about half of what you see. But still you're missing about half the real situation. So these are some plots of different where we degraded to different spatial resolutions. And essentially the answer is about 200 meters. So if you have 200, maybe even 300 meter data, you can probably detect the fires that are responsible for more than 90% of the energy and therefore 90% of the air quality problem in terms of emissions. So you don't need to go to 30 meters and things like this. I went over this yesterday. We do validate all this stuff. Typically with aircraft, we put instruments on aircraft. It is quite complicated. So you have to, for example, have these thermal cameras I showed yesterday that basically have different integration times, because you saw in the first picture that, early on in the graph, that basically in the middle infrared, the radiance goes up hugely in a non-linear way with temperature. You can't get a middle infrared camera that basically can measure from 0 to 1,000 Celsius, for example, as you might need. So you basically have a special camera that takes a very snapshots very, very quickly with different integration times, all the way from about 30 microseconds, which captures only the very highest temperature parts of the fire but unsaturated, all the way down to thousands of microseconds down here, which basically you can see all the fire and the background and the cloud and stuff. But these very bright bits here will be saturated. You basically have to assemble all this data together to get a quantitative measurement. So we do all this flying over fires and identifying them. This is this Meteosat third generation. So this is the second challenge. What is the spatial and temporal resolution trade-off? So to some extent, I've kind of talked about that already. But this is this data that is just about to be released by EUMETSAT. They've had a problem, basically. This satellite probably cost €1 billion, and it has a calibrator on it. We were talking all about calibration yesterday with Dave, and essentially it has a mirror that look at the Earth, mirror goes down, look at the calibrator, and unfortunately the mirror is stuck. And the mirror is fortunately stuck in the look at the Earth position. And so they don't want to. There is a second set of electronics, I've been told, that they could actually engage and it will work again. But they're a bit worried that if it sticks again, it might stick in the look at the calibrator position. So they're not going to do that, and they've calibrated it against other instruments like IRs, and apparently it's working really well. So I think the data, we have got some of the data only very recently, and it will become operational in a month or two, I'm told. And it is really good. So this is an answer over Europe, at least, for the spatial temporal trade-off issue. This is the current satellite called Meteosat second generation. So we developed the Fire product from that. It's delivered by something called the Landsat. You can get it online. And here is a Fire in Portugal. The data are about 3 kilometers spatial resolution. It is pretty good for detecting fires every 15 minutes, but they have to be quite large. This is the Meteosat FCI data, which is basically 500 meters in shortwave infrared and 1 kilometer in the middle infrared and the longwave infrared. And it's got RGB channels and all sorts of stuff. It looks fantastic. And it is going to be, at the moment, it's every 10 minutes over this side of the Earth disk. And once they launch the second one, they'll have a rapid scan over Europe, which will be every 2.5 minutes. So I think that you'll be able to detect fires in Europe before they're reported by the public. Some of them, at least. I'm going to show you this, if it works. Hang on. This is an animation from EUMETSAT. Here we go. Because we haven't got the data yet, but can you see? Oh, that's not working. No. How do I share that? Can I share that? Maybe I can't. Can I share that?
You should be able to share that if you push that to the second screen.
Oh, okay. Push it to the second screen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. No, hold on. I'll do it again. Pretty confusing. Hold on. Media player. Right. Is that up there? Yes. Okay. No. That's a lag, right? Yeah. So that is every 2.5 minutes. They have run it in 2.5 minute mode for a bit. I think I'm not even sure who can identify that island. I can't. I don't know where it is, but I think that's Crete, isn't it? The big one. But yeah, but that is pretty amazing. And somebody from NOAA was at this meeting where you met last week, and basically said, they're just designing the geostationary satellites now for America that are going to be after the current goes. And he said this is better than what they're designing for 10 years' time. So Europe has done pretty well there, I would say. So yeah, we're really excited by that. I think it's going to be very amazing for all sorts of applications. Right, I'll get on with it. Okay, one thing that this did, so we have got some data. These are some fires in Portugal that happened in September. The red line is FCI, the new one. The blue line is severely, what we do at the moment, and green and blue dots and occasional observation of fire nodes and doors. And what you see is when they all view at the same time, they're roughly telling you the same power output from the fire. But this one starts 4 hours before. So we saw this fire 4 hours before. I mean, detected it with an algorithm, not visually. And we haven't even tweaked this algorithm. It was just basically the Meteosat second generation one we applied to it. So it's fantastic. So I think fires in Europe and wherever else this instrument can see, mostly Africa, are going to be very, very well monitored. The last challenge was about estimating emissions from active fire data. This was the burned area-based method I told you about at the start, where you basically combine burned area satellites for all this modeling stuff from how much fuel the area is burned. This is the other alternative, which I was telling you about, where you basically just measure the power output and multiply it by a number. what is the number? That's the question. And whilst we thought all these small scale experiments in Rotherham were great and gave us the right number, maybe it isn't the right number when you're observing a huge satellite detected fire from space rather than a tiny little thing burning on a wooden tray from a thermal camera. It's not too bad, but we thought we could do better. And what we did was essentially, I think I'll just slip onto that. We used this thing called Sentinel-5P, which is an amazing instrument that measures air quality. And not particulate matter, it measures trace gases, columns in the air. And so this is the trace gas column of carbon monoxide, which is highly prevalent in fire plumes. So we can detect the fires, as you've already seen, which is the yellow dots, and we can also detect the plumes of CO. And with the geostationary data, we can basically, when Sentinel-5P comes over in the afternoon, we can identify this plume, and then we can say, okay, how much energy did this fire emit from the time it started up to when we saw that plume? And basically, that energy, the fires produce that energy and that amount of CO, and so that makes one dot on this line, on this graph, right? That says, okay, in shrublands, this particular fire here emits 3 megajoules of energy, and it releases 3 times 10 to the 9 grams of CO. And then we do this for hundreds of fires, and we basically get a relationship that just converts energy into, in this case, carbon monoxide. And all we have to do then basically is divide by the emission factor of carbon monoxide, which is very well known, and we get energy into carbon. And then we get these lovely plots over there, which we can do every 15 minutes. These are for southern hemisphere Africa, and we can do this every, super good. There's almost no assumptions in this. We've actually compared it to GFED, and amazingly, it gives almost the same result. So GFED's actually doing a really good job, probably also because it's been tweaked over years of the parameters to give things like the right amount of atmospheric concentrations of certain species they could measure during the time it's been developed. But we can do this in real time. Here's some atmospheric model fed with that data, and then you can we sampled this model basically with Sentinel-5P observations and found really super good agreement and very little bias between the two, so it seems to be working. And that product over there is basically, this is being done operationally now from the Landsat, the EUMETSAT Landsat. You can get this fire emissions product, not only CO, many other gases and particulates as well, and then we'll be transitioning that to this Meteosat 3rd generation imminently once we get the data. So this is, that's what basically these kind of things look like. This is over West Africa. So you get, a daily cycle of 100 observations from Meteosat 2nd generation and even more from Meteosat 3rd generation. And you can see this huge diurnal fire cycle, which is why geostationary data is so useful for fire, because when the time of day that you observe, you see completely different things. So you can't just observe one time a day if you want to quantify things. All this data goes into these atmospheric models. These are all things from the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service. This is this global fire assimilation system, which uses some of these methods. And they put that in, they put the emissions in, and they can forecast air quality and such like. This is Indonesia, where we went in 2015, and we went back in 2019. We put up all these little air quality sensors, which we calibrated in the combustion chamber to measure smoke particulate matter concentration, because they give you particulate matter concentration, but it's not correct in fire affected environments. Any of you know about air quality, you will see that and you'll think, well, that doesn't look very healthy, which it is not. Something like 300 micrograms per meter cubed is the level considered extremely hazardous, and that was 3,000. It's because of all these terrible peat fires, basically where the land is on fire, not the vegetation. And we then, this is the last slide, we then basically compared the data from the air quality services we put out to the data from the CAMS air quality model that produces PM2.5 conservation of the service in a city in central California called Canberra. And we found amazingly that they're doing pretty well. I mean, the grid cell size was, I think it's like 50 kilometers or even worse. but it captures the temporal cycle pretty well. It's been fed with data on fires, but it's been the fire emissions of particular matter, exactly like what we talked about. But even the latitude is pretty good compared to the in-situ measurement. So this stuff seems to work quite well in this particular case. Here's the city we were dealing with. We're now doing this in northern Southeast Asia. It's not working so well. That's much more topographically varying, and all our sensors at the bottom of valleys in villages, whereas the CAMS grid cell is like incorporating mountains and things like that. So it's a much tougher job, but this is relatively flat here. If you want to see all these sort of things, they're all in Windy. If any of you know Windy, you can get all the fire radio power data, and you can get all the atmospheric fields that are produced by Copernicus. So there's particulate matter and CO, and all the active fire data available in this, which is called FIRMS, NASA FIRMS. There is a button somewhere over here when you log on. It's called when you get to the website. It's called Advanced Mode, and if you go into Advanced Mode, you see all the products here in the station, which are basically the ones that we produce. They're generated at Lisbon. Lisbon had the computing facilities and in a meteorological department. So we basically give our algorithms to Lisbon meteorological department. They run them on the data, and then it all goes to firms and is available for anyone to use. That's it. Thank you.
We have one working and one not.
Yeah, it is, but sometimes it's something not.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Martin. Really interesting talk. I had a couple of questions. Firstly, you mentioned saturation, and I wondered how much of a problem that was, obviously with the channels that are designed to observe fires, but with the ones that aren't that you're using, I don't know how well they saturate.
Yeah.
And because obviously your relationship will break down at that point because you get the channel saturation.
Yeah. So, well, fortunately, we only really have to have unsaturated data in the middle infrared, which is the one that would saturate because that's the one that's super sensitive to fire. In the shortwave infrared, you can detect fires at night because shortwave infrared is basically emitted by very hot targets at night. In the day and at night. In the day, there's so much sunlight around you can't see it, but at night it is, and we use it actually for gas flares. And that is actually it's really good for detecting gas flares, and you can detect the energy output of the gas flares, which corresponds to how much gas is being burned. If you do that with something like Sentinel-2, then it will saturate it.
Yeah, that's what I wondered.
Often. Yeah. So I would use Sentinel-3. You don't need super high resolution data, and then it is not saturated. In the middle infrared, what's the kind of stuff I've been talking about? Because of this essential climate variable categorization, all these images are now being designed with very high dynamic ranges in the middle infrared. Usually, just like that thermal imaging camera I mentioned, they have to have more than one channel. More than one channel in the middle infrared. A low dynamic range and a high dynamic range. Yeah. So SLSTR has this S7 and F1, for example. I was on this team that helped specify the Meteosat third generation kind of observing characteristics. I was a little bit for fire, and it was like 15 years ago or something. It was so long ago, and that is now. I mean, it's nearly. I think it's 480 Kelvin. I think it can measure up to. So it is. All these things will saturate at some point, but is very. It'll be like one in 10,000 pixels or something. It'll be so basically. I don't think saturation is much of a problem now. Okay. It's kind of been solved. AVHR,
the old sensors,
ATSR, all designed for sea surface temperature, all saturated. But anything, MODIS basically showed you this is all possible and useful, and so everybody is designing things that have that capability not to saturate mostly.
My other question was about cloud as well,
Yes,
because
classically cloud.
yeah. So what does that? Do you miss a lot of fires because of cloud? Obviously, because of the wavelength
Yeah,
you're using.
it's quite funny. Not many people mention cloud. You know, it's the dirty word of thermal remote sensing.
Yes. And I was also thinking about the particulate matter emitted by the fire as well, or is that too small to affect those wavelengths?
No, we can see through that.
You can, yeah.
I mean,
thought we probably
it definitely does have some. If it's a massively thick smoke column,
then it'll
you can still
affect
see the
those
fires,
wavelengths.
but it probably does affect quantitatively. There's very little work done on that. I mean, if it contains loads of black carbon, it's probably absorbing the radiation stuff. But I mean, I think it's not too much of a problem. I would say that.
Cloud is.
Cloud is a problem. Fortunately, in general, fires are most prevalent in periods of the year when there's not too much cloud. So there has been some analysis done about what the effect is. So, for example, this Meteosat product we generate, there is a cloud-corrected version, which basically looks like the proportion of pixels covered by cloud, and we assume there's as many fires under cloud as there are in not under cloud. There probably aren't more, so it's probably quite a good assumption. I mean, it makes like less than 10% difference. So, but I have to say that African savanna is not a very cloudy place. So probably in something like Brazil, it's probably a lot worse. That's another benefit of the geostationary, to be honest.
Yeah, you get more
the clouds move about, the fires are moving slower, and so typically you can detect them at some point. Not necessarily every time, but you can detect them at some point. So I think that is a benefit of the geostationary. Yeah, cloud is definitely a issue.
Thanks. Okay, thank you.
That's a good point.
Thank you for the presentation, Martin. I just have a normal question. Like, how do you draw a line between false positive rate and false negative rate when you're coming up with these algorithms?
How do we know? Well, we I think it's a process of iteration, I would say. So these algorithms, they've been long prevalent, right? So we know how to detect, or we know how to discriminate fires from warm, bare surfaces. We know how to discriminate fires rather from cloud reflections by day, or places where the land meets the water and the spatial misregistration of the two channels might cause, the middle infrared band to see more land and the thermal infrared band to see more water. That basically can trigger fire detection. So we kind of know how to do all that because people have done it in the past. And then we validate all our data against higher spatial resolution observations. So with the geostationary data, we've typically used MODIS or VERS. It sees the same fires a few times a day. So we basically have done lots of work saying, is this real and is it not? That kind of approach. There was something else I did. Oh yeah, when we did the SLSTR algorithm, it's quite funny. 10 years ago, solar farms were not really a problem for fire detection because there were hardly any of them. But when we did this SLSTR algorithm, we were getting all these fires over the UK. It was like, wow, what's going on here? And it was probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And then we started looking on Google Earth, and there's all these solar farms. So we had to come up with ways of discriminating that. It's similar to the sun glint things. So I think at some point you just have to also, what is most important for the users? Is it to detect everything that could possibly be a fire, or is it to detect only things that you're certain are a fire? And different users probably have different thoughts on that, and therefore you probably should have a confidence parameter, of which there are in these products confidence parameters, but they've never really been looked into very much. Broadly speaking, the higher the rated power output, the more certain you are it's a fire, and the lower the rated power output is, the less certain you are. And VERS has a problem with false detections over a place like China. When they released this 375 meter product, I think they said 40% of the detections were incorrect because there's just lots of landscape and big buildings surrounded by cooler paddy fields and things that just look like fires to these sort of algorithms. And I'm sure it's going to improve now, but that is one problem, that as you go to as you go to higher and higher spatial resolution, there's more things that give signals that look like fires at that spatial scale. So you might have to degrade your algorithm performance a bit. In which case, why have you bothered making this data, higher resolution in the first place? So I think Aurora Tech, right? I think you're probably going, pretty good idea to go 200, 300 meters. That's probably the level that you want to be at, not 50 meters. There's probably no point.
One follow-up question: what's your take on forest clearings for the fire detection? Because often cases, forest clearings are like looked as fires because they're completely warmer compared to the surroundings. Yeah.
Well, we're actually supposed to be doing an airborne campaign in Brazil in August, whenever it is, 25. So we'll find out, because that's one of the things we will look at.
Okay.
So
thank you so much.
We'll wait.
I would also have another question. So, might be a little bit controversial, but the Dozier method, which is a classic, it provides fire radiative power. But you already mentioned that the output of the fuel that you have produced in Rothamsted, obviously every fuel has a different heating value, so there will be differences. So, what is the added value of fire radiative power for the users at all, other than relative intercomparison?
So that's a lot of information in there. So basically, this Dozier method is an approach essentially to, when I showed the big green pixel, the little red fire, it's basically a kind of bunch of simultaneous equations if you observe in different wavelengths, that you can't just get the energy coming out of the fire, you get the temperature of the fire and the size of it. But it's only the effective temperature in the area. It's not actually the real one, because the real fire is multiple different temperatures. And so I think essentially those temperature and area parameters aren't really that useful. They're not they're telling you something, but they're not telling you enough that it's useful. And we've done lots of experiments in our lab. We've actually got a paper just coming out, one of the PhD students. And we've actually measured the ratio of, say, CO and CO2 versus the effective temperature coming out of this Dozier method, which has basically been stated to be, you can just threshold it and say if it's less than 600, it's smouldering, and if it's more than 600, it's flame. Basically, they don't relate, because the effective temperature in the air is not really the real temperature. So the Dozier method, I would say, is probably not that useful. And there are problems applying it to core stage as well, which we won't go into. But you can certainly use the values in this Stefan-Boltzmann law to get the radiative power, and it's just as good as the way I've shown. It basically is the same, but you don't need so much input variables for the data I've shown. And then you said about so actually, that's a good point. Well, the heating value is almost the same for all vegetation. That's one of the benefits of this. If you take 100 different types of vegetation and you burn them all, you basically get the same amount of energy out, plus or minus 15%. So it doesn't really matter what type of stuff is burning, which is a real benefit, because you basically can't tell that from satellites, unless it's some special plant with huge amounts of oil in it or something, which is unusual but does exist. So the heating value of what's called the heat yield is very similar to plants. So that is not a problem. The reason that the little experiment value may not be the same as the value you should apply to satellites, and it's not that far off, but it's not to do with that. It's more to do with things like, in a forest, if the fire is on the ground and you're sensing it from the space, you may not see all this energy coming out because if something's hidden by a tree canopy. Another thing is, how are these fires burning? So we looked at the relationship to carbon monoxide in a grassland. The amount of carbon monoxide per unit fuel consumption is quite low because the fires are flaming, and in a forest where there's lots of smouldering wood and things, it's quite high. So it all takes into account that, basically. All those things that are to do with how the fire is actually behaving in that environment, how the observations relate to what's happening on the ground, they're kind of taken into account by this just simple correlation. It kind of hides lots of issues, but overall, works pretty well because it's kind of, on average, it's taken into account all the different problems that are biome specific.
We have another quick question.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you tend to use radar measurements in combination with thermal to resolve some of these issues?
We don't. I don't know. I mean, the only thing I know, I mean, radar basically can't pick up active fires. I don't think it's not. It's as far as I understand it. The burned area has been looked at using radar, basically because some areas are so cloudy, like Indonesia. Normal burned area mapping algorithms essentially don't work very well because you essentially don't see the surface regularly enough. So radar has been used for burned area mapping, particularly in forests, but I personally haven't used it really. What do you think it would be useful for?
Oh, I'm coming into this new. I'm just trying to see what the
Yeah.